Now, let me bring in William Lawrence, a professor of political science and international affairs at the American University, joining us live from Washington, D.C. Professor, thank you so much for joining us here on TRT World.
Pleasure.
As a former U.S. diplomat, what do you think about the Trump administration's argument that this was, in fact, a law enforcement operation, and because of that, it didn't have to ask Congress for approval?
It was, except that it combined elements of a military operation, and it's been bombing Venezuelan targets since August, and that was a military operation called a war. And so it's not just a law enforcement action, but these are military actions as well, which raised a really interesting legal issue, which I didn't hear in the setup, although I didn't hear all of it. But Maduro claimed in court today that he's a prisoner of war. And the U.S. is arguing, well, it was a legal action. You're not a prisoner of war. But the U.S. has been arguing internally and internationally for months now that it's taking these actions against narco-terrorism as actions of war, and they're legal as war activities. And so the U.S. is contradicting itself. It's saying it is a war and it isn't a war, and that's going to make the legal case Maduro illegal. It's going to make Maduro's legal defense easier because the U.S. keeps contradicting itself.
I'm just wondering, given everything that's happened over these last couple of days, does it all mean that sort of international law has become obsolete and that under Trump's so-called Don Road doctrine, it's now the big powers with the biggest guns that can decide whatever they think is right, such as going in and capturing the leader of another country?
No, the U.S. is at a very low point right now under Donald Trump and his disregard and disrespect for international law, including his own violations of it with some regularity. But previous U.S. presidents have violated U.S. law. Think about Obama's drone policy. Think about various U.S. invasions over the years, and yet the scaffolding of international law is extremely important. And just like most citizens most of the time follow the law, most countries most of the time follow the law. And those international norms are really, really important. Otherwise, everybody could be invading everybody all of the time. And actually, in the last 70 years or so, we've had less war on the planet than we had before the international norms that were created after World War II came into place. We've also had less killing of civilians, which would surprise some people. But, what's going on now is that Trump is trying to unwind the international norms that the U.S. helped create after World War II and go back to a 19th century policy of might makes right, imperialism, stealing other countries' resources, spheres of influence of the great powers, which begs a whole bunch of other questions. But if I could just name one, if the U.S. is claiming the Western Hemisphere, which was the 19th century U.S. policy under President Monroe and afterwards, what happens to Ukraine? What happens to Taiwan? What happens to the Middle East? Are those ceded to other great powers? Or is the U.S. trying to eat it, have its cake and eat it too, and saying, no, we get the West, but we also get to have an opinion on everything all around the world. And this is where the U.S., again, hypocrisies and contradictions start to argue against themselves.
Yeah, there's a big argument whether this means that the U.S. has now become sort of a regional power instead of a global power. But I want to focus on another thing here, Professor. There's a report in the Wall Street Journal that the CIA concluded that it was Maduro's loyalists that would be in the best place to sort of pick up the baton once Maduro was captured, and not the opposition who actually won the popular votes back in 2024. Do you agree with this assessment?
More or less, yes. And this is the U.S. military and other people I know, and I've actually talked to some people inside government who are making these arguments, that de-Baathification of Iraq was a total disaster, equivalent things that happened in Libya and other places, barring the government officials from the government can unravel things really quickly and create chaos, instability, internal conflict, and eventually civil war, which we've seen in a lot of countries when you fire everyone who's in government. But what should have happened is that the opposition should have been included in a national unity government, in a transitional government, which is what most Venezuelans want. Venezuelans did not sign up to to have the Chavistas stay in power, to have the Maduro regime stay in power. And a lot of people who voted for Chavez later on voted for Machado and Gonzalez because they weren't necessarily against Chavezism. They were against the corruption and they were against the current president, and they wanted him out. But then, the ideological position of the new government isn't clear. It wasn't clear which way the Venezuelans would have gone once this leadership was out. So the U.S. is really missing an opportunity here to say, hey, whether or not you agree with our law enforcement action, we're turning everything back over to the Venezuelan people, elections as soon as possible, a national unity government in the meantime. Instead, Trump didn't even mention democracy in his press conference and in his subsequent interviews. All he's talking about is oil.
Yeah, and then you had Edmundo Gonzalez appearing on TV over the weekend, calling himself the rightful commander-in-chief. Where does it all leave Venezuela now, with Trump propping up the new interim president, who was the former vice president under Maduro, and then you have the opposition trying to put itself in a position as, claiming the rightful seat of power, but not getting the backing of the U.S. administration?
Things are extremely dicey right now, and every hour counts, every day counts, every move of the Venezuelan people through their government and in the streets matters. Every move of the U.S. government matters, it's really hard to tell which way this will go because it's clear the U.S. had no plan. No cogent plan, no plan for transition. It's just assuming that with Maduro gone, things would get better, just like the U.S. assumed with Saddam Hussein gone in Iraq, things would get better automatically, and all the other types of wishful thinking that goes with any country invades any country, including Russia. Russia thought they'd take Ukraine in 3 to 5 days, so that there's a lot of wishful thinking that goes into military actions. And then you realize, that maybe you didn't calculate correctly and you have to make corrections. And, hopefully the Trump administration will come to its senses and turn things over as quickly as possible to the Venezuelan people. And there's an international process involving other Latin American states that sponsors a return to democracy in Venezuela with the help of the Colombians and everybody else, that says, there's a place for the opposition and for the Chavistas in the future of the Venezuelan regime. And we could start by getting some political prisoners released from jail, which is why so many countries at the United Nations today were asking for the Venezuelan government to start with that.
All right, Professor Lawrence, always good to have you on the program. Thank you so much, sir.